Good evening. I'm Dave DiCacello, and it's my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. I first want to thank Kay Lyle, our entertainment chair, for putting together a terrific program. Obviously, it's so graduate to many of us because he's been an active and loyal member of our club for 35 years and a good friend of mine for many of those years. Now, I'm not surprised that we have a sellout audience tonight because we have a fascinating topic and a speaker who is the only one in the world that can tell the story that you're about to hear. Now, when I began to jot down some notes for an introduction, I quickly ran out of superlatives, so forgive me. After graduating from Notre Dame, he went on to receive his MA and PhD from the University of California in mathematics, of course. He taught at Brown University since 1967. A listing of his papers and publications would fill a book, and I don't want to take your time on that. And I don't believe there is another mathematician alive who has received as many honors and awards. These include being named the Rhode Island Professor of the Year, the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of the Year, and receiving honorary doctorates as well. His courses continue to be extremely popular at Brown, and he is revered by his many former students who are doing great things in mathematics and computers around the globe. He has a worldwide reputation for his scholarship on the fourth dimension and is recognized as his chief apostle. He is a pioneer in applying computer graphics to the fourth dimension. And when there was a major conference a few years ago to celebrate our speaker's 65th year, it was aptly titled Thomas F. Banchoff, a man of many dimensions. So when it comes to mathematics and the fourth dimension, it's no exaggeration to say that he is an international rock star. When mathematicians assemble from around the globe, his presentations usually get the biggest audiences. So we are proud that his groundbreaking mathematical artwork was exhibited here at the Providence Art Club. I encourage you to check out a virtual exhibit online. I think you'll find it spellbinding. It's not surprising that a surrealist like Salvador Dali would become an admirer and personal friend. I know that we're all looking forward to hearing about the remarkable confluence of art and mathematics that brought our speaker and an iconic surrealist together. So let's hear about the fourth dimension and Salvador Dali from our very own Tom Banchoff.
Thank you, David, for the opportunity to come and speak. I am not only 35 years as a member of the art club, but I'm 35 years as an artist member of the art club. And I really want to tell you how that happened and what it led to. But we have a title which says Salvador Dali in the Fourth Dimension. So first of all, I'll prove to you I met Salvador Dali. That's Dali on the right. That's 1975. But the story starts a lot earlier than that. And I really want to talk about, well, let me use the opportunity for a few minutes anyway to talk about myself as how I got to be an artist member, which is a story in itself, I think. I started out really interested in drawing and geometry. I really enjoyed having a chance to take a look at a diagram about a three-dimensional object that was rendered on a page, so you had to learn how to build it. I learned how to go back and forth from 2 and 3 dimensions, and I decided at one point I really wanted to be an architect. I know there are a few architects in the audience, but then I started learning to draw. The first drawings I ever did, I looked them up on the web. How many people know John Nagy? Yeah. John Nagy had a show, You Are an Artist, back in the 1950s, and I used to love to follow his step-by-step things. I actually met John Nagy because I lived in Trenton, New Jersey. I spent the summer with my country cousins up in New Hope, Pennsylvania, which was an artist colony, and people would come down from Greenwich Village to paint there in the summer. And I learned as a young boy, 9 or 10 years old, that if you were very quiet and never said a word, you could stand behind an artist and watch her paint or watch him paint. And I used to love that because if you stood there for a long time, you could see a blank canvas turn into something that was magical. You know? Now, of course, John Nagy used to do that a half hour with charcoal, and I would practice it and all that sort of thing. I only got to meet him because his son went with my older cousin, Barbara Jane. So that was the most famous person I had ever met up to that time. And in fact, I was interviewed by Ernie Kovacs, who used to be local WTTM in Trenton. And he said, "Do you know any famous people?" And I said, "I met John Nagy." Okay? Unfortunately, he's been supplanted by Salvador Dali, the most unusual person I ever met in my life. I do have to say, though, that after I was introduced to the art club, I came in 1967, but I didn't really come here until about 1974 when somebody invited me to come up. After I met a few people, I really loved having lunch here, talking to all the people who weren't mathematicians, who weren't even professors, you know, people who were real people. And it was a lot of fun, and I decided at one point at the men's table that I think, you know, someone said you ought to apply to be a member, because I was a guest up to that time. And then, I'll never forget it, one of the people at the table was Ira Rakitansky. I had spent the afternoon with his daughter, who is an old student of mine, at a meeting, and she reminded me that her father couldn't come tonight, but he said something which changed my life, which was, not only should you apply to become a member, you should apply to become an artist member. I said, "But I don't paint and I don't draw." He said, "I'm an architect. I'm an artist member. Haven't you had a show?" And I said, "Yeah, I was actually a part of a couple of shows." He said, "More than some artist members." And I applied. And I must admit, for those of you who are artist members, you know you have to submit a dossier of things. And there's a committee that gives very strong, you know, looks at them very closely. Well, I really blew their minds because I submitted a poster, a film, and a set of stereo slides. They didn't ever see one of those things before. I actually have the poster here. I brought it in one of these boxes. And this is it. Could you do the next slide, because we're getting a little, well, actually that's not what I wanted to show, but that's good. Tom won't mind. Go back. Tom Skoros, actually this is very nice because Tom Skoros was my first teacher here. The slide itself is of a spiderweb type thing that was fascinating to us because by studying and moving around on the screen, we could actually understand things that nobody had ever seen before. People knew the equations, they knew all about this, and they wanted to know about it. And when we drew this thing and just captured this particular spiderwebby thing, it, again, everybody I would show it to, mathematicians I would show it to, would point out the different mathematical things they saw. But then the artists would start looking at it and looking at it in different ways and telling me different mathematical things that they saw or artistic things that they saw. So I felt, well, maybe I am an artist. And I won't show you the other things, but I'll show you, I'll say that I had the temerity to say that I decided if I'm an artist member, well, if I'm a member, I wanted to learn to draw figures, you know, figure drawing, life drawing. Well, there was a problem. The problem is I wanted to go to the Duffers class, which was the beginners who had never tried a life drawing thing before in their lives. And they said, "You can't do that." I said, "I can't do that?" They say, "No, you're an artist member. You have to go with the professionals." So I did. I mean, I did. I went to the professional class where Tom Skoros was teaching. And he was so wonderful. This is a Ken Buck picture of him, only a portion of it, but he was so good as a teacher. He was so encouraging. He said to me, "You can come." I said, "I don't really know." He said, "It's all right, you can come." Is Joan Arnaud here? No, unfortunately, she was on the list of people who were going to come. She saved my life that very first class. I was sitting there, you know, with my professor costume on, and kind of sitting there, and I took out my notebook, which was lined paper, and started drawing, you know, very tentatively. And Joan came over and said, nobody should have to draw on lined paper. And she gave me a beautiful piece of paper. And from that point onward, I really felt confident because these were friends. These were people you could learn from. You could learn from Tom, but you could learn from the people you sat next to. I would come early so I could sit next to Bill Gardner. Bill Gardner, I don't know how many people knew Bill? Bill was a wonderful illustrator. And if you sat next to him, again, it was better than John Nagy. You could sit there and watch the thing take shape. You could see how he developed it, how he moved it around, how he refined it. And I started trying to emulate him. And that, for me, was one of the biggest things. Now, again, I have to ask, I know Ruth Emmers is here, and she was in class with me. But who else? Anybody else in Tom Scors's class? No? Oh, you missed it, because he was so great. But as it was, that gave me some confidence to learn to draw better, and also to talk about art with my friends, with my partners, with my classmates. Next slide. Next slide. This is the Friday Chowder and Marching Society that met, and I was so happy to be a member of this group. And a couple of these people are well known. I know that Jim Goff knows this fellow. This is Carlton Goff, his uncle. Carlton was the dean of the whole table. Every once in a while he would throw something out like, I remember how sad my parents were about their friends who had gone down on the Titanic that week, okay? Or the other thing he said that blew my mind was, Halley's Comet wasn't so bright this time around, okay? But I really respected his, and David Aldrich in the back is a lot of, I know Ruth's favorite. She used to come early so she could sit next to David. And Garv Morris and Ray Parker were there. We have wonderful, wonderful things. And we debate about, about art. Now we had a debate because I had a show in 1996. I know that the invitation to this, this position here, this exhibition, I'm sorry. The invitation to this talk talked about an exhibition that was in 1996. Did anybody actually follow that link and look at the show? David did. Maybe at the very end of the show, if you really want to see it, I'll show you how to get to it because it's online. And what it is a show that had a number of pictures that were from the kinds of mathematics I was doing. Not the mathematics of the spider web. That's really all we could do for the first 5 or 6 years. But after that, we started doing some other pictures. And I will show the kind of debates we had. The next slide shows one of the images from the show at the Dodge House Gallery. Now, this is, when you do a mathematical piece like this, you have some problems because there are some things you're supposed to do, right? You have to write a little description of the piece. We wrote 2 descriptions. One was nice words talking about color and how the shades worked, and the other was the mathematical formulas, because there were some people who came who knew mathematics and wanted to know what formulas they were and why we wanted to study them and why it was 4-dimensional. Other people wanted to figure out what the colors were and what it was doing. It asked what size the picture was. Well, what size do you want? Okay, that's right, anything. A person later on, when they saw this picture, said, oh, I really wish I could have seen the original show. Now, what's the joke? What they saw in the original show was a photograph that was mounted on foam core. That's a copy. This is the original. Okay. The argument we were having at the table was which way to hang it. I mean, several of the guys liked this way of doing it. Carlton liked the next way. Okay. He said, can you go back? I don't know whether you can go back. Try it. He said, you guys are so pedestrian and so conventional. He said, you all think of this as sort of a scene where this is the water down below, the dark earth color, and the bright light up in the top. He said, you want people to think when they see your paintings. So the next picture showed what he wanted, which is actually more interesting. They won. We had agreed to go by the majority. But then the Math Association, I was president of the Math Association at the time, wanted to put a picture on the cover of their Math Horizon magazine, so we call it Math Horizon. And next slide. They did it sideways. I don't like it this way, but that was okay. It's whichever way you want, right? Okay. Now, let's see, I forgot what the next slide is, but the question is, we were back when I was a kid in Trenton, New Jersey. Several people here asked me, how did you get interested in the fourth dimension? When did you first hear about it? And I can answer that question to the minute, because I was a fan of comic books as a 10-year-old. This comic book was Captain Marvel. He's called Shazam nowadays. And I had to buy this book. It was expensive. 15 cents was the most I had ever spent for a comic book, but it was 100 pages, and it promised something. It said, we're going to show you the world of your tomorrow. Well, I knew my parents didn't know very much about the world of my tomorrow, and I suspected my teachers didn't, so I bought this manual, okay? In the manual, the next slide shows I could have drawn this thing without even getting a copy of the thing later on. It's a reprint. It's Billy Batson, boy reporter, gets into a Bugatti to go off to a science building, and it says this, I want to show you where I plan my inventions. And boy reporter says, what a story this is going to make. And the next slide, these are my 3 assistants right now working on the 7th, 8th, and 9th dimensions. And blink, blink, blink. I wonder whatever happened to the 4th, 5th, and 6th dimensions. That was it. Okay, I'm still wondering, okay? That changed my life. I knew it had something to do again with geometry. I liked architecture, I liked models and so forth. And I thought, if they're going to spend all this money to make a fancy laboratory, it must be important. Now, of course, this is not what you see in an ordinary math laboratory. Of course, there weren't any math laboratories back then. What's missing from this picture? We can have some audience participation here. Computers. There's no computer in here. No computer. There were computers in 1945, 46, 47. But the computer was much larger than this room, and people could only think of a few things that you could do with it, possibly. I remember Thomas J. Watson, for whom the computer science building is named up at Brown, was quoted as predicting that by the end of the 20th century, there would be as many as 20 computers in the United States. And that's really one of the few predictions that actually came true, okay? In any case, this is not what you'd ordinarily think, but an artist was given the job, paint this, or come up with a math lab, and he did. I got to meet the artist. Next slide. This is C.C. Beck, artist of the golden age of DC Comics. And this is taken in 1983. Yes, 1983. We're jumping all over the page now, but this is way ahead of the game because this was at the opening of the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. How many people have been to that museum? A few of you. It's really worth the trip. I mean, I wouldn't make a special trip, but if you're down there for some other reason, it's worth the side trip. It's really a great place because it's a marvelous collection. And we'll come back to that a little later. But it was great meeting C.C. Beck, and he said, I was given this job, and I just tried to imagine laboratory, and that's what I did. I said, well, you changed my life. That's great. Next slide. This is what computer laboratory looked like. It's a little sad now because those of you who came to the meeting, the annual meeting in June, know that in the necrology was Charles Strauss. And I know Mr. Scheidler is here, a good friend. This is Charles. Charles Strauss had gotten his PhD at Brown in computer graphics just the year I arrived, 1967. I came with lots of problems. I had been trying to understand how to visualize the fourth dimension. Charles had been trying to solve applied math problems and had to do with piping networks and very complicated three-dimensional arrays. But he came up with what one of my friends described as a three-dimensional blackboard, where you could actually draw things and then rotate them and make them move around. Not fast. In those days, it was very slow, but you could do it. And so Charles unfortunately needed new problems because his program was wonderful, but it cost more to run than 11. It did the work of 11 engineers, but it cost more to install and run than the salaries of 11 engineers. So he needed new problems, and I had problems. So it was a perfect collaboration. Collaboration is very big at Brown. It's one of the biggest things that happens there. And for me, it happened so soon and so dramatically. Charles and I worked together for 12 years and did films within a couple of years in the late 1960s of things that nobody had ever seen. I showed you that picture of that spider web thing, but you could actually see the thing moving around in ways that never happened before because they were not just moving in the third dimension, they were moving in a totally different way into the fourth dimension. And nobody knew what that would mean to an artist or to anybody looking at it. You had to try to get a kinesthetic sense of what was happening and why changing a little parameter, changing a rotation, would give you very dramatic things. Charles came in one day and said, you know that thing you wanted? I've got it up on screen, and it's beautiful. And I came in and said, well, it really is pretty interesting, but it's wrong. He said, how do you know it's wrong? I said, we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I know what has to happen. If you're here and you go there, you have to go through this space. And we looked at the code, and I said, what did you do here? He said, I divided. I said, no, you're not supposed to multiply. And he changed it, put a card in and create reader. And he says it's not so beautiful anymore. I said, it's right. And that was the way we worked, back and forth. It was a very, very fine collaboration because he could do things I couldn't do, I could do things he couldn't do. And we created films, we created slides, and we created the images that showed up in our first show, which was in the 90s. Let's see, David, could you give me that picture? Yeah. Don't fall, please. You can bring the, okay, that's it. Yeah, this is, let me see if I can just put it up here to the side. This is an example of something that when Charles and I were doing things, by this time we were starting to use color. And this is, after we had been working for a number of years. But what happened with this color was that occasionally we were making different choices. And I said, I really like that picture. Charles says, I do too. It looks like a reflection in a pool. The same old thing that Carlton Goff and I were arguing, or the people would argue about. But it was, again, serendipitous to see something like this, but it was pleasing. And what pleases the eye, what pleased our eye, pleased other people's eyes. So in the very first set of pictures that we did in the first exhibits, this was one of the ones I still like very much because it was one of the first things that convinced me that some of our work would be pleasing to other people. And of course, they saw different things than we saw, which is one of the greatest things about working with artists if you're not an artist yourself, or after somebody decides you are an artist, you talk to other artists and get impressions that are marvelous. Anyway, let me move ahead because we've got to move ahead. This is interesting. Just about everything is interesting in mathematics. I mean, I like these boxes. Everybody else use these boxes? You put them in and you knock them out and you put them in. And sooner or later you put it together and you get yourself a nice box. Well, it was a nice box before, or at least it was the instructions on a box. But now it's a box. Okay? Boom, 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 boom. That'll do it. Here's the top. And you put it on. That's mathematics. That really works. Now, as it happens, I already had a box like that. Because for my thesis, I really needed to be able to build things out of squares. And I had to build things that couldn't be put together in three-dimensional space, or even in four-dimensional space. I had something for my thesis with Professor Chern that required that you go to six-dimensional space to do it. And I thought that was pretty interesting because nobody had ever visualized things in six-dimensional space. So it was a little hard. But of course, that box that I just played with is the equivalent of a box here where I can build a cube. And then I can actually, let's take it apart a little bit. Because that's what I've done is given you yeah, that's better. This is what mathematicians would call the net of a cube. It's just an instruction set. If you had a cube, a cubical box, you could send it to somebody in a bigger box, partial post, or you could save it better by doing surface mail. That's a mathematical joke. Okay? So you make it into the surface like this, put it in an envelope and send it. But you have to send something else. What do you have to send along with it? Instructions, right? And what are the instructions? Well, again, you have to paste these things together, and paste this together, paste this together. That gives you an open box. And then you put the top on, it gives you a closed box. That's pretty nice. So that's going from a two-dimensional space to a three-dimensional space. But what happens if you wanted to go the next step? If you had a four-dimensional box and you wanted to send to a friend, you'd save time and energy by folding it out into three-dimensional space. And I needed to do that for my thesis, and we did. And I have to tell you, one of the great things about teaching at Brown is you get to collaborate with people at RISD. Okay? 2 days ago, I went over to the RISD store and bought myself a piece of big board like this so I could reconstruct this model. The one I had was so shoddy, I was embarrassed about it. And so I had to cut it up into 8-inch squares, but they had to be perfect. So I asked them what they would, if they could do it in the shop, and they said, no, we can't do it. So I went next door, and I said, where's graphic arts? And they said, third floor up in the back. And I went in, there was one fellow in there, big room. His name is David Colvin. Anybody know David? He is the most helpful person I've ever seen. I went in and told him what I wanted to do, and he said, we have just exactly the machines here, and we spent 3 hours together. It only took about 45 minutes to make this. But then we started talking about all the different geometry, all the different kinds of things that people did, and all the students, what the students at RISD did in Freshman Foundation and all these other places. And so ultimately, he made the whole thing. At the end, I said, what do I owe you? He said, how about a handshake? And here it was. Okay. Yeah. Now, I kind of like that, okay? Well, it does a number of different things. I mean, for one thing, it has some kind of funny motions to it. And again, for my thesis, I had to really figure out how to put that together in six-dimensional space. And, well, we did. I recognized, though, as I was building it, that I had seen it before. I had seen this figure before, or almost the same thing. And not so long ago, I was doing a cleanup job. After 47 years, any place, you got a lot of cleaning up to do. And I found a book. Turns out I kept a diary only once in my life, in about 1955. And as I was going through it, I found August 30th. This is literally last week. And it talks about going up to New York. That's a big deal for somebody from Trenton. It'd be like going to Boston. Yeah. What I said here, we got to, let's see, okay. We arrived at 9 o'clock in New York City. We walked in Central Park before entering the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Quite a place. Dali's crucifixion was impressive. Dali's crucifixion was impressive. Dali's crucifixion had been painted 1 year earlier. It was shown in London before it ever came to the Metropolitan. So we were seeing it one of the first months that people actually saw the painting. That made such an impression on me to realize that that was in the back of everything, because the figure that I needed for my thesis was really already in Dali's Corpus Hypercubicus. There it is. See? That's the central figure. Corpus Hypercubus or Corpus Hypercubicus was the name that was associated with the crucifixion, which was what it was called when I saw it first. They subtitled it later, and that is the unfolded four-dimensional cross. I have a version here, which is a little, where the instruction set is a little easier to follow because of color coding. And we'll see how this thing actually works. The color coding is telling you what side's supposed to be pasted to what side. The yellow side to the yellow side. The white side to the white side, the red side to the white, and we can do that. Oh, but the green has to go to the green and the purple to the purple, and you can't put it together in three-dimensional space. You really need a new degree of freedom that we don't have. It would be like trying to put that cross-shaped figure together without going to three space. You can't do it if you just stay on the plane. You've got to move in a new direction. And if you had a new direction, you would be able to put this together. It really lives up in four-dimensional space with 8 different cubes on the outside. But it's unfolded for our benefit. Dali was using a geometric figure which was well known in the 19th century, and certainly well known to the artists who hung around with geometers in the left bank in Paris in the 1920s. I'm sure Dali saw that image in a geometry book and thought, you know, unfolded from a higher realm into our realm. Well, that's the incarnation. That's the crucifixion. Down below, by the way, you see the shadow, which is the unfolded cross. So three-dimensional shadow down below. I began to wonder, why did Dali do it, and how did he do it? Going back to John Nagy and Bill Gardner, I wanted to see how things developed and why people did them. Here's the model from our book. I have a book called Beyond the Third Dimension. It's going to come out in a fully electronic version within the next year or so. It goes back to 1990. And in it, you see at the top 4 edges that you can put together to form a square if you're willing to go into the plane. And here's our instruction set, and here's the object here. So again, I knew by this time this was one of my favorite objects. The folding portion is something I discovered. Okay? I mean, all the pictures showed a solid object sitting here. I found that folding was easier for getting through transportation safety, TSA at the airport. You know, nobody asked you what you were carrying when it was flat. Okay. In any case, next slide shows you that as I showed it around to people, this was from my friend Jose Iturralde, who was also an exhibitor in the first show I ever was involved in. This is above the Mediterranean Sea near Valencia. So he wrote to me and said, "I'll bet you don't know that your hypercube flies." Now I like this because by this time I was looking for projects for my students to do. I was teaching, I taught at Harvard for a couple of years, and we started doing the fourth dimension. When I got to Brown, they started what they called a new curriculum. The idea is that every professor had something in his heart or her heart that got them into their subject that they'd love to share with a bunch of willing, eager freshmen. And I had that project. I had that thing, the fourth dimension. I've taught over 15, 16 years, 16 times over these years, every second or third year. And I've taught it at Yale, and I've taught it at Notre Dame, taught it in University of San Francisco last year. It really does grab students because we can talk about the fourth dimension as not just being the mathematics, but what it meant to an artist, and what it meant to a philosopher, or what it meant to a person who wrote novels, or poetry, or theology. It's really a great, great topic because it takes you out of your field into other people's field. Next slide. This is the big changer. Okay? Kurt Norris was a publicity guy at Brown, and he was trying to get us to write up our stuff because he thought it was pretty neat. And he said, "I've got a friend, Tom Zito, down, who works for the Washington Post." I was going down to a conference down in Washington, and so Tom Zito said he'd interview me. We interviewed for an hour and a half. He wrote down that every time I wrote a name down, I mentioned a name, he said, "Let me make sure I've got the spelling right." The article appeared, my name is spelled wrong in every single time. In any case, that's all right. When I got things from people later on, I knew where they had seen it, okay? So this is the style section, the second part of Salvador Dali's, of the Washington Post. And so he interviewed me about this new computer graphics. And here I am with my model. That's what I looked like. And he had an inset up here. Now I know there were a couple of lawyers in the audience. And I was a little squeamish when I came back because I know Dali loves publicity, but he loves it under his own terms. And I knew that they didn't have a chance to call up the Metropolitan and get permission to put this in the paper because it was the previous night. So a couple of weeks later, I got a call. And the call was on one of these little pieces of pink paper that you get in your cubby hole when you came back from class, before email, of course. And it said, call so-and-so in New York, representing Salvador Dali. So I said to Charles, what do you think? And he said, well, it's either a hoax or a lawsuit. So I called up, a woman answered and said, Senor Dali is in New York. He wants to meet you. So I said to Charles, what do you think? He said, well, it's either a hoax or a lawsuit, but the worst we can get out of it is a good story. I'm sorry, in the beginning I was talking about Charles. I really am dedicating this to him because, well, the reason his name came up, of course, was the necrology. He died this past February, and a terrible loss. Charles and I went down to New York, and we did meet Dali, and we got a great story. Not just one story, but a whole sequence of them. Next slide shows the second part of that story, and shows something else about the artwork. One of the pieces that they showed was a picture of a four-dimensional cube. A three-dimensional cube has 8 corners, square has 4 corners, 4, 8. This has 16 corners. It's rotating around in 4 space, and it's got after images in it that make you think of something moving, like the early 20th century painters who tried to show things in motion. Of course, it was an artifact of the computer because the computer wasn't very fast and wasn't very good about letting go of the images it already had. But the artists like this. So when Linda Dalrymple Henderson wrote her big thesis at Yale in the early 80s in the art history department, 800 pages on the 4th dimension and non-Euclidean geometry in modern art, she traced all these different themes that I went through. A lot of people think the 4th dimension started with relativity, and that's what she thought. But then she went back as an art history major and found out that there was an entire world of 4-dimensional notions that took place in the 19th and early 20th century before anybody caught on to the idea that it was useful for physics. In physics, you need 4 numbers for an event. Three dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. We hear about that. I'll meet you on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 4th Street at the 5th floor. Well, you could write 3, 4, 5 in your book, but unless you put a number in, 10, 3, 4, 5, 10 o'clock, you wouldn't have an appointment. An appointment requires 4 numbers. The geometry of those 4 numbers is a little bit from the geometry that tells you how far you are from the starting point to the 4th floor, 5th floor, but it's still a geometry. What we're doing here is a different kind of geometry. It's a 4-dimensional geometry, which is purely the analog of going from 1 dimension, the line, to 2 dimensions, the plane, to 3 dimensions in space, and just keep going. Okay? The machine draws something on a line by having 1 number. To get something on the plane, it needs 2 numbers, how far over, how far up. 3 numbers get you off the plane. A 4th number gets you off our space. It doesn't work. We don't have a 4th number. But if you did have a 4th number and built something there with your erector set in 4-dimensional space and took a picture of it in our space, that's what we'd see. That would be the real thing. So that's what I'm doing with my students, helping them see in so many different ways how you can take an abstract construct and visualize its projections, its slices, all the different kinds of things that enable us to understand something in 3 space. Let's go on. Here we are again. I want to point out a couple of things. I mentioned stereo slides. This was 1975. It was a little later, 1978, that I became a member, so 35 years ago. But this is the box that had the stereo slides in it. stereo was important because Dali himself, the reason he had called us is that he had just finished a project on holograms, and he wanted to move on to a new project on stereoscopic oil paintings. That meant that you'd have two different paintings, and you'd be looking at them through glasses in a certain way. One thing for your left eye, one thing for your right. Well, we take it for granted now. But this was, Buona Devil and House of Wax time, really primitive 3D. But he wanted to see how that would help people understand some of the things he worried about and, beyond. He was very fascinated by science. And he was up on science. It was interesting talking with him because someone said, well, couldn't you do this with holograms? And he just completely dismissed it. He said, no, holograms are not ready yet. You can't do a holographic movie in 1975. You can't do one in 2013. We can do a lot of things that are approximating it. But he was right about the technology, so I was impressed by that. But here was my opportunity. I asked him, can you tell me why it was, where you got the idea of the corpus hypercubus, and why did you paint it? And he said, Raymond Lull. Now I said, Raymond Lull? You mean the 12th, 13th century mystic and polymath from Catalonia? He said, yes, you know Raymond Lull? And I said, well, yeah, I do. And it was one of those weird things. Ever since I came to Brown, I would always try to find one course completely outside mathematics. So I could, it's good for the mind to get away from doing one thing all the time. And so I'd find a course, and I used to find really good courses in religious studies. Now Lois Atwood, who's here, was the secretary in the religious studies department, so she knows all the people I'm talking about. But I used to take the course, this particular course was a visiting professor from the University of San Francisco, where I taught last spring, Robert Ignatius Burns, S.J., and he was teaching a course on the history of the church in Spain and Italy in the 12th and 13th century. I figured, well, that's safe. We're not going to get any mathematics there. Answer, no, not safe. Raymond Lull wrote travelogues, he wrote poetry, he wrote novels, the equivalent of novels, and he wrote mathematics. He did everything. He was sort of the equivalent, he did theology. He was kind of the equivalent of St. Thomas Aquinas from Italy in his part of the world, Spain, which is the part of the world Dali's from. So this is a remote forebear of his. Next slide shows some of the stuff he's doing. This is an Enneagram. Anybody know Enneagrams? Yeah, one of my classmates' daughter just wrote a big book on Enneagrams. It's a personality thing like MMPI. Whatever it is, Raymond Lull had figured out how to put things on wheels. So if you had a problem, you started out here with one hypothesis, have another one here. As you rotated one into another, you get the solution. It was kind of an automatic problem answering machine. And in fact, he claimed that you could answer all possible questions using this technique, all possible questions that could be asked in this technique. Well, that's pretty interesting, of course, but not exactly right, since, among other things, mathematicians know you can't construct a 9-sided figure using ruler and compass. So that kind of ruined that aspect, but of course, most people don't worry about things like that. In any case, I was amazed to see that this concept of sort of finite argumentation would work. The next slide shows something from his work, which was a two-dimensional cross with things. Well, we recognize this. He worked in the second dimension, but you could go up into the third. The next slide shows two paintings by Dali called The Martyrdom of Raymond Lull. He came to a bad end, or at least and mathematicians looking at this would notice something that the art historian who was making the complete collection didn't notice. What's unusual about this? What's the mistake the art historian made? Which painting came first? Neither. Why not? Because it's the same painting. It's just rotated upside down. See the thing here? There it is up there. Another thing rotated over. It's just It was just the slide was turned upside down. But because this is actually kind of marshmallow, it's very three-dimensional, if you will. And so it was lit in two different ways. So every once in a while, a mathematician or somebody paying attention will be able to spot an error that somebody else made who was just looking for one thing and didn't notice the other symmetries. Next slide. About 10 minutes. That's not so great, is it? Well, let me go fast, okay? Till 9 o'clock, 10 minutes to 9? I started at 15 after, and I was promised 45 minutes.
I'm giving you the 10 minute.
Okay, thanks for the 10-minute mark. Okay, Juan Herrera. 3 centuries later, Juan de Herrera was an architect who was a follower of Raymond Lull. Next slide shows what he did. He didn't work in the plane, he worked in 3-space. Next slide shows that he, instead of using labeled 2-dimensional diagrams, went to 3-dimensional diagrams because he was an architect. Next slide. He did El Escorial. Okay, so here we are. We have Raymond Lull, 3 centuries later, disciple of Raymond Lull, same part, same town, same part of Catalonia, and then 3 centuries later, Dali. So 2nd dimension, 3rd dimension, 4th dimension. That was the answer. That's why he did it. He was really amused about this. The next slide. Dali did this painting. And this is a painting that mentions Juan de Herrera in it. But as it is, you can see it's a cube inside a cube. That's a different view, a perspective view of the hypercube. We had a cube next to a cube, and here's a cube inside a cube with Juan going down. This slide here is one of the first paintings in the 1950s series, 1951, I think, the God's eye view, God the Father's view of the cross. Okay, next slide. And this is apparently from St. John of the Cross. That's attributed to him in the margins of his missal. Next slide. This is the model. This is Russell Saunders. He was you can see it in his obituary. He was a stuntman, very strong. He did a lot of things for Burt Lancaster and people, Burt Lancaster did his own stuff, but he did all those swashbuckling type things. And he had the job of standing there doing that cross thing for some period of time. And it was very arduous. But he said in the obituary, it was quoted that he said, "I stood in for a lot of stars, but that was the first time I ever stood in for Jesus Christ." Next slide. I found this book in the library at the Salvador Dali Museum because A. Reynolds Morse, the person whose collection is housed there, tried to recreate Dali's working collection. He found the books that were in Dali's library and bought copies of them at great price. And here you can see the exercise is to draw crosses from a lot of different points of view. Next slide. Here we see these crosses from different points of view. Next slide. In 1954, the same time he did that Corpus Supercubicus that we just saw, he did this model here, which is a sculpture. But I recognized it. I said, I've seen that in a book somewhere. And sure enough, next slide, here it is. It's in one of the books that was apparently in Dali's library, an exercise book that he used when he was a student. He was classically trained. Of course, you have to be to do what he's doing. Next slide. Here's another view of the same thing. And a standard picture, it turns out, a standard exercise was to do both crosses together. And ta-da, there we are. In this book, you saw this prototypical thing. I'm sure Dali, listening to these people at the left bank, said, I've seen that somewhere before. And there it is, okay? And he used that for a central figure. There it is. Next slide. The thing about the book that's really nice has how old it is. I actually have a copy of it. I bought a copy on eBay. There it is. I only had to pay $100 for it because of condition mauvaise, in really bad condition. It was falling apart, but that's okay because I wanted to take it apart, right? And the interesting thing is the date, MDCCL. Everybody know that? believe it or not, a lot of my kids, my students don't know Roman numerals. I don't know how they, yeah. Well, it's 1750. 1750. This is older than Brown University. Okay? We're going to have our 250th anniversary next year. Next slide. I thought that was the record. And then I found out, looking at another book in the same thing, this is 1646. That's almost as old as Harvard. Okay? And here we are. It's not quite the same thing. It's the model I showed earlier. It's the cube surrounded by cubes. And this is a Franciscan, Francis Niceron. Now, the next slide really is bringing up something which I find totally mysterious. And it just dawned on me this morning. I had seen this picture in Dali's work earlier, and he's got this solid, I mean, the cross is made, it's solid, but it looks two-dimensional because you're looking straight down on it. And I hadn't paid very much attention to it because I'm interested in 3- and 4-dimensional crosses. But today, when I was looking up the provenance of all Dali's works, he had 1,500 paintings, okay? This is one that was a homage to Raymond Lull. So he was thinking of Lull's pictures. It was done in 1975. Why was Dali thinking about Raymond Lull in 1975? I don't know the answer, but I'm intrigued because it was 20 years earlier that he had painted the painting of the Corpus Hypercubicus. Well, my wife Kathleen says that we should leave that for some art historian to work out sometime in the future. But there's a connection there. Do we have time to see some more slides? A few. Linda Henderson, I mentioned earlier, she had that figure on the cover of her book. The new edition just came out. It's got 400 more pages. So if you want to find out about history of fourth dimension, just go to Linda Henderson's major work. Next slide. If you have any questions about Dali putting these things together, here they are. These are the models that were made at that time, wooden models. And here's the model that was the basis of the cross. Next slide shows it, a famous painting, a famous sculpture thing. And you can actually see that the various blocks are separated slightly, right, away from it. They're bolted in. And the next slide shows more about how the painting was done. The picture of Gala is a photograph. He worked from photographs. I didn't know that, but he did. Next slide shows the study he did for the figure. And I'm sure he made the guy, whoever did the model, it might have been Russell Saunders, I'm not sure, he made him stand there and he photographed it because you don't really want to hold that pose for very long. The next slide shows, that by the way was from the Vatican art collection. So here we are seeing the thing again, coming down again with all the slides. And you can see the separation here. Next slide. By the way, if you want to hear this lecture given down at the Salvador Dali Museum, of course without all the references to the Providence Art Club, you can go to YouTube and you'll see the whole thing. Next slide. That was 1975. In 1976 I went down and he said, let me do, this is Pour Mon Ami Benchoff with a little drawing and a Dali text that he gave to me. Next slide. He was painting this when I was watching. It's a famous painting. If you see a woman looking out the window, that's okay, right? But that's not what it really is. I usually say, if you're over 50, take your glasses off. So everybody take your glasses off. And now what do you see? If you want to do squint hard. So your eyes are almost closed. Who is it? Abraham Lincoln. It's Abraham Lincoln's face. Now I just made it smaller, so you go back to the other one, sure. It's given away by this little thing, which is 200 gray squares for me, but looks like Lincoln to you. The kind of thing that we do for the Mars rover, you know, that takes the pictures that come back from Mars and enhances them, you can use it to disenhance something. So that little bit of information here is enough to recreate Lincoln's face. That's what the NSA is using when it's looking at your pictures, you know, as you go through. Next slide. Let's go back. Next one. By the way, this is an earlier thing, the skull of Zaragoza, which, again, if you squint hard, looks like the skull. What you have is the standard optical illusions here, the tiling and the three-dimensional version of it. So Dali was doing, he loved to play games inside your head. And that's what he was doing here. That's a bunch of monks, Dominican monks praying. This is a PC thing, right? Okay, next thing. Why am I showing this? Well, it's just a very bad picture of a picture. It's because it's signed. Next slide. Pour Benchoff, homage to Dali. It was a $3 thing I bought, and it might be worth $5 now or $6. Who knows? Next slide. He was, as I said, about to do stereoscopic oil paintings, so he, of course, took photographs. Next slide shows it. And again, if you did it, you'd have to stand there either with glasses or you'd have to have some sort of trick to give one thing to your left eye, the other to your right eye. I didn't see him painting this, but I saw him painting the next series. The next series, this is from School of Apostolic Palace, Vatican City. There are 4 walls in this particular palace room, and each of them has an identical, what do you call it, an archway. And so what he did was take 2 of them, take the next one, and it's the same archway. And then he would feed that, next slide, your left eye would get one picture, the right eye would get the other picture. So there's no way you could fuse them. He put these squares in there to try to help you use the stereo kind of fusing. But of course your eyes would be retinal rivalry from the School of Athens to the Fire at the Borgo, back, boom, 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 boom. Again, something's happening inside your head, who knows? We're almost done, I guess. This is a painting, the only painting he used that had the 4th dimension in the title, À la recherche de la quatrième dimension. And it's the only one where he has the melted watch in with the stereo picture here and a few of the things that come from 4 dimensions. This painting is probably even more famous than the National Gallery. Again, the Sacrament of the Last Supper. It's not the Last Supper, it's the Sacrament of the Last Supper. This is the resurrected Christ. He's transparent, and he's inside a 12-sided figure, a dodecahedron. One of my students said, what's the significance of 12? Okay, next slide. Well, okay. I guess, what time is it? Are we done?
Yeah.
We're done. A little bit later, okay. Okay, this is a painting from the Salvador Dali Museum called The Ghost of Vermeer that can be used as a table, okay? Again, Dali doing something that makes sense here, but doesn't make sense if you do this. Next slide showed, of course, he's taking a picture of a woman, and that becomes the, next slide, the surrealistic version of it. So this is very realistic, but of course that's not. And you're supposed to be imagining the perspective difference. Next slide shows probably the most expensive thing I own. It's an original Dali. It says Benchoff, Dali, 1980. We met every year for 12 years. Okay. Every year he'd call up when he got to New York. This was actually in Paris. Oh, no, I'm sorry, no, this was still in New York. But what he did was design a horse project. And the project was you'd make a sculpture of a horse, and you'd set it up so that if you came out the gallery, you'd look up and you'd see this horse looking down at you, you know. It looked perfectly proportioned. But then as you walked around to the side, you realized it was actually 100 kilometers long. And the head was here and the shoulders were here. The rump was 100 meters away, 300 meters away, whatever. And it was only from one point of view that it looked right. Only one point of view. So he's playing with perspective again. Next slide shows the other side of it. This is the guy looking at his really distended horse. So he wanted us to work out the mathematics for that. Next slide shows a drawing actually done by somebody else, but following his suggestions, again, the horse from here. But instead of having 300 meters, he wanted 300 kilometers. So your shoulders would be 100 meters away, and the rump would be on a mountaintop in Toledo. Then the next year, he was in Paris, and he was losing it a little bit, I'm afraid. He decided to change the scale again so that the head would be here, the shoulders would be on a mountaintop, and the rump would be on the moon. Not only would you have to be in the right place to see it, you'd have to be there at the right time. Space and time, yeah. Okay, I would tell my students, this is what Charles and I did when they sent us the little plaster thing and we were going around, showing different ways of looking at a horse as you could go. We tried to figure out what the Trojan soldier's view of the horse. Okay, stop now. Don't go to the next slide yet. This is what the world looks like from the inside of a horse. Okay, that's great. Now, the last slide I'm going to show is when I talk to my students, I tell them, of course, this horse will never be built. It's very impractical. Now, you don't say that to students. Why? What do they say? We're going to build that horse. And the next slide shows a beautiful horse. Nicely proportioned pony there, you know. And you can admire it until you start walking around it. And you go further and realize that it's 3 separate pictures. There used to be 2 chairs here, but Kathleen, my loyal assistant here, removed 2 of the chairs so you could actually see the distension between the thing. So again, this is Dali's corpus hippocraticus, sorry, corpus horse. His horse, so everybody in the class would take turns being in the right place, but the 3 kids were very, very happy with their nice horse there. And I think there are fortunately several places to stop this lecture. And so I think I will stop the lecture now. Thank you. Thank you.
What was he like to talk to?
What was he like to talk to is the question. That's very interesting because in public, he was outrageous. Honest. When we first met him, that picture was taken in a cocktail lounge where he was kind of holding court with people. People would come in from the outside, he would greet them, he'd tell them where to sit, you know. He had this whole circle of people around him. And he would talk in Spanish, he would talk in Catalan, he would talk in French, he would talk in English, and it was all very, you know, mishmash and outrageous. People expected him to be outrageous. When he wanted to talk to you about something serious, like stereoscopic oil paintings or horse statues, he'd invite you up to his studio. He rented 2 apartments, one for himself in Gala and the other as a studio. And that's where I saw the different paintings that we saw. I saw them when they were half done. And he would talk very clearly. Now, not terribly clearly, but the emphasis was on communication. So that when he would ask a question, and if I didn't understand it, I'd ask him to repeat it. And he would until I understood it. And same thing with the answers back and forth. He really wanted to communicate. And he had done his homework. So, I mean, he knew the properties of the materials he was using. He knew what he wanted to do with things like perspective and things like that. So I felt that the emphasis was on communication. So it was totally different from his public persona. It was very, very interesting. And, you know, I kind of liked him. Yeah. Other questions?
I'm not sure I understand what the 4th dimension is.
Yeah, you should take my class. The question is, I'm not sure I understand what the 4th dimension is. Oh, that's the way I feel. I understand a lot more about it than a lot of other people do because I do understand how to communicate with the computer. See, the great thing about the computer is it doesn't know what dimension it's in. You fool it. You say, I'm going to do this thing. Here are the numbers. You know, here's a point, here's a point. They have 4 numbers, four coordinates, whatever they call them. I connect that, connect that, connect that, and connect that, connect that. So you end up with something that looks like, approximates a circle. Now, it might look like an ellipse, but if you hold it right, it would look like a circle. If you hold it right the wrong way, it might look like just a segment, you know, if you hold it down. But you learn how to move things around. Of course, that's a two-dimensional object. You're looking at it in different ways. A four-dimensional object, you get some weird pictures sometimes. But they're not random. They're very careful. You see very carefully the way it works. The way an architect would take an architectural drawing where you see the front view, the side view, the top view. And an architect really can probably imagine in his or her own mind exactly what it's going to look like from the northeast corner. And after a while, you could train yourself to be able to figure some of that stuff out. And that's what we're doing. I mean, I've shown my students computer graphics that move, moving pictures. You can see some of them if you go to the website I mentioned earlier. And yesterday, I took my 20 students up to the cave, which is, this big cube. And when you get inside the cube and you're wearing these stereo glasses, you're immersed in a three-dimensional environment. And we have it on tape. Alex was there, the fellow who's taping tonight. No, I guess it was Adrian. But we got all the oohs and ahs. I mean, it was like watching people taking a roller coaster ride because they were moving it around and reacting to it viscerally. And those students, by the end of the semester, are going to be able to see things that they've never seen before and interpret what they're seeing. That doesn't mean they're seeing things as well as we're seeing three-dimensional things. But it does mean that they've learned something. They've learned something about the way these things work. The way I worked with Charles, and without knowing exactly what to predict, I had a good feeling about whether what I was seeing was possible. Okay? So you never are going to completely understand the fourth dimension. I'm never going to understand it. It's great to have a subject like that. I'm never going to run out of things to do. And yes?
Quantum physicists, they're telling us some pretty weird effects of quantum effects these days. Is there any point of contact between the kind of thing you're doing and quantum?
Yeah, I spoke earlier. I don't know why we can't get the lights on, but that's okay. Can you see me? Okay, yeah. Sorry, Sev. I mean, as long as you don't mind seeing this ghostly vision of me. The question was about physics. I've talked a little bit about space-time, and that was the relativity physics that went up until relatively recent years. Oh, look at that. It's light. Anybody who has to go, please leave. But I can answer a couple more questions if you like. The physics nowadays is much more inventive because they are trying to take care of many more different phenomena. And some of those phenomena are very, very small. They're all sort of coiled up in little things that are so small you can't quite see them. And so in order to keep track of all those things, they don't want to just have 4 dimensions. They have time, but not just 3. They have 11 dimensions or 26 dimensions. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I'm still working on 4. But I've got a pretty good idea of what 4 is. And what I found out is that every physicist who starts talking about the 4th dimension, about higher dimensions, say, first of all, try to figure out what it's like to get to 4. And they go through the different exercises. The one we had is one of the exercises. They fold out and how it fits together. There's another one called Slices. That's Flatland, my favorite book. Different world. Different lecture. But another way. There are 3 or 4 different ways that people have traditionally looked at the 4th dimension. But as far as I'm concerned, what I was trying to do is get inside Dali's version, what he cared about. I should mention that Dali, when he first saw this model that I had, he said, "I may have this." You asked about whether you could understand. I may have this. It wasn't a question. I may have this. And then he explained to me that the reason he wanted it was his new museum in Spain. Has anybody seen the museum in Spain? In Figueras? Yes, Lyle's seen it. It's really a fascinating museum. You might not have noticed it, but on the 2nd floor, there is a vitrine, a glass case, which has in it my model. It's big with it's aluminum, and inside there's if you put a 20 centavo piece in the slot, it makes it rotate. and plays liturgical music. It's really hokey. It's very funny. And so, yeah, inside there's in order to make this universal joint work, you have to have a shaft. So he has a shaft inside which has a crucifix on it. It's really funny, but in the same place, you see the actual wood model that he was cradling, that he liked so much, that he used for the thing. So everything comes around. There's no attribution in the model, but that's okay. I'm happy. Thank you very much.